Hello, from our bubble to your bubble. At the time of recording this message, we're still in Code 4 lockdown, in isolation, trying to keep up with the daily news, really missing our church fellowship. Like most of us, this enforced lockdown means much more time at home. And to us that means a bit of gardening, home maintenance, many walks around the block, and greeting our neighbours as we go. As well as this enforced self-isolation has given me much more time to think and reflect, especially on this issue, our situation and how to respond to it. As I was thinking on this, my mind was drawn to a memory of a front page message I wrote for our church newsletter quite so many years ago. At that time I wrote about a book I have here at home. It's written by an American pastor named Tommy Tenney. In this book, God's Eye View, he writes of our need to be raised up in worship so that we can see our world from God's perspective. In chapter 1, he writes about his memory of travelling in an elevator with his then 3 or 4 year old daughter. He writes that all was going well until more and more people crowded into each floor. But let me leave this to Annette to read you the actual story from the book.
Tommy Tenney writes, I well remember when my youngest daughter's view in a crowd was limited to a field of knees, belt buckles, backsides and purses. My memory holds such clear snapshots of the look on my 3-year-old daughter's face when we stepped into a hotel elevator to go downstairs. Everything was fine until that luxurious but limited space started getting crowded. It seemed that at every floor, people tried to squeeze themselves in. Some people battle with fear of close spaces well into maturity, but the concern is universal among members of our knee-high population. If you were on that lift when things got crowded, it probably wouldn't bother you much. The reaction from my little girl, however, was purely predictable. Her little arms would shoot straight up and her eyes would rivet me with urgent intensity. Have you ever thought about the view available from a typical 3 or 4 year old on a crowded elevator? I'll never forget the sight of my little girl's arms reaching upwards and the way her eyes sought me out in quiet desperation. She was saying, "Pick me up, Daddy. I can't see from down here." Once I picked her up and raised her to the level of her father's eye view, she had no problem. If I was distracted or my overly full hands left my daughter stranded down among the growing crowd of knees and purses, her young mind became despondent and full of anxiety. I can imagine her saying to herself, "I can't see very good." Worship is a process of stretching our arms to the heavens in the universal sign of surrender and desperation. It is the way earthbound creatures rivet the attention of their heavenly Creator. When you worship, it is as if you look at your Heavenly Father and say, "I don't like the way things look down here, Daddy. Would you lift me up? I want to see things from your point of view."
So how very much we can compare this to our situation today. Here we are all in lockdown, hemmed around by negative comments of others, the flood of mainly bad news from the media, all the doom and gloom, and all we tend to see are the problems and dangers that press into us, threaten to overwhelm us. So just like Tommy's daughter, we just can't see the big picture from our perspective. We can feel insecure. We too can feel lost, surrounded, hemmed in. Of course, for us who believe at times such as this, our faith tells us that God can see the big picture. He can see it, and we know that He's always there to help us in our distress. After all, His promises to lift us out of our troubles are very evident in His Word. Psalm 46 verse 1 is a great example. It says, God is our refuge and strength, and ever-present help in times of trouble. Since the Bible reminds us we are God's dearly loved children, perhaps we need to follow the little girl's example. Say to our Heavenly Father, lift me up, Daddy, I can't see from down here. I'm sure that when we are lifted up and into our Heavenly Father's arms, we too will feel secure and contented, able to see that God is in control. When that happens, we will see things from God's perspective. And after all, what can ever happen to us when we are safe in the arms of God Himself? I was reminded of Psalm 91, a psalm that seems to crop everywhere in these troubled days, which leads me to think of just one verse, the first part of verse 4. It reads, He will cover you with His feathers, and under His wings you will find refuge. In the light of the situation we're currently in, I much prefer the translation in the Passion Version of the Bible, and that same verse which reads, His massive arms are wrapped around you. You can run under the covering of His majesty and hide. When we shoot up our hands to God and ask to be lifted up, we are transported into His massive arms that are wrapped around us. Surely there's no greater place of security and safety. One final comment from the quote from Tommy's book, where he writes, worship is the process of stretching your arms to the heavens in the universal sign of surrender and desperation. Perhaps God is trying to get us to that stage of desperation when we have little choice but to lift our arms and surrender and worship. I'm sure that's when we will all know the security of having God's massive arms wrapped around you. God's richest blessing on you as you rest in the Father's arms.